My name is Marianne Kettering. I'm 66 years old. Charleston in December smells of pine needles and sea air, a mix that never fails to make me ache a little. The streets shimmered that evening, white lights tangled through the oak's wreaths on every porch, the kind of postcard charm that used to make my daughter Caroline squeal with delight when she was small. I drove slowly toward her house, the pie tin warm beside me, the Bordeaux resting in a linen bag on the passenger seat. I'd saved that bottle for years. My husband and I bought it on our last trip to France before his heart gave out. Tonight, I'd planned to open it with family to remember him properly. Caroline's house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac lined with new mansions, each one competing for the grandest wreath. Hers was the largest, draped in gold ribbon. I parked behind her husband's black SUV and sat for a moment, letting the quiet hum of the car fill the space where courage should have been. The front door opened before I could knock. Mom Caroline's voice was bright, rehearsed. She kissed my cheek, her perfume sharp and floral. Behind her, the foyer glittered with white marble floors and a chandelier shaped like falling ice. "You made it right on time," she said. "I left early," I replied. "Traffic's light on holidays," she smiled politely. "You can set the pie in the kitchen. Mason's carving the lamb." The kitchen looked like a magazine marble counters. Candles, place cards at every setting. I placed the pie near a platter of roasted vegetables and unwrapped the wine. "Thought we could open this after dinner," I said. Caroline glanced at the label and hesitated. "Oh, that's lovely, Mom." But Edward brought a bottle from his private cellar. Mason's planning to pour that instead. I nodded, pretending not to notice how she avoided my eyes. "That's fine," I said lightly, though my hand tightened around the corkscrew I'd brought from home. The grandchildren barreled in, saving me from the silence. Grandma Julia wrapped her arms around my waist, and little Henry tugged at my sleeve. Their hugs steadied me. I told them they'd grown, that they looked wonderful, and they beamed as if I'd handed them each a crown. When Edward Hollister arrived, Caroline's father-in-law, everything in the room seemed to shift. His voice filled the space deep and practiced the kind that came from decades of being listened to. Caroline moved toward him instantly, brushing imaginary lint from his coat, laughing at whatever he said. Mason followed, with 2 glasses of wine, both for the men. I stayed by the children until Caroline called Mom. "We're ready to eat." The dining room sparkled crystal glasses, gold chargers, candles low enough to flatter everyone's face. I carried the pie to the sideboard, then walked toward the head of the table. That seat had been mine since my husband passed every Christmas since. Caroline saw me paused and smiled too sweetly. "Oh, Mom," she said, gesturing toward the same chair. "Could you sit down there tonight? Edward should take this spot. He's the guest of honor." For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. "I always sit here," I said softly. Not as protest, but habit. The room fell quiet. Mason glanced between us. Edward cleared his throat. Caroline's smile stayed frozen. "It's just one dinner," she said under her breath. "Please." The silence around us felt heavy as the silverware. I stepped aside, slowly moving to the empty chair halfway down the table. My legs felt unsteady, though I didn't show it. Caroline slid into my place beside Edward, laughing again, as if nothing had happened. I folded my napkin across my lap and looked at the candles trembling in their holders. The air smelled of rosemary and wine. Somewhere in the house, the grandchildren's laughter drifted faintly through the hallway, innocent and far away. By the time the first course was served, I had stopped tasting anything at all. And before the meal ended, Caroline would do something I would never forget. Dinner began with the sound of silverware and polite conversation, the kind that fills a room but warms no one. Mason poured wine with a salesman's smile, attentive to his father's gestures. Caroline's laughter rose and fell like a performance. I'd seen her wear that voice before. Smooth, charming, slightly higher than usual, the tone she used when she wanted to belong. When the platters came out, lamb potatoes glazed with honey asparagus, arranged like a magazine spread, I stood and reached for my usual chair at the head of the table. It wasn't vanity. It was simply habit, something steady in a house that no longer felt like mine. Mom Caroline set her hand light but firm on my arm. "Could you sit down there tonight?" I turned to her, confused. "Down where?" She motioned to the middle seat on the opposite side. "There, Edward should sit here. He's the guest of honor." Her voice was soft but rehearsed a line she'd prepared in her head. Edward Hollister looked up from carving his lamb and gave a small, apologetic smile. "Please, Marianne, don't trouble yourself," he said kindly, though he made no move to refuse. I could feel every pair of eyes at the table flick toward me, the grandchildren Mason, even the housekeeper passing through with bread. I tried to keep my voice steady. "This is the seat your father used to take," I said quietly. "After he passed, you asked me to keep it." Remember Caroline's lips pressed together. "I know, Mom, but tonight's special. Edward has done so much for us." The room seemed to shrink. I saw my reflection in the silver platter, older, smaller, standing beside my daughter, who suddenly looked like a stranger. She was beautiful in her navy dress, polished as ever, but there was something hard behind her smile, something that reminded me of granite. I let go of the chair and stepped aside. "Of course," I murmured. "Guests first." She exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath, then guided Edward to the seat with both hands, her head bent slightly toward him. The gesture was almost reverent. Mason refilled his father's glass before his own, and Carolyn laughed too brightly at some comment about the wine's age. I found my place halfway down the table between Julia and Henry. The children were kind. They asked about the pie, about the family dog I still kept. Their chatter softened the sharp edges in the room, but even they could sense something had shifted. Julia kept glancing toward her mother, as if trying to understand the change. Dinner continued in a fragile rhythm. Forks clinked glasses, touched conversation, moved safely around weather and business. I tasted nothing. My hands stayed folded in my lap, while laughter rippled at the other end, where Caroline leaned toward Edward as though sharing a secret. It wasn't anger that settled over me, then it was grief. Quiet and precise. I realized that somewhere along the way, my daughter had begun building a world where I no longer fit, and this table, once ours, had become a stage for her belonging. When Mason raised his glass for a toast, I lifted mine too, smiling like the perfect guest. The wine burned down my throat, but I didn't flinch. I simply waited silent and still as the evening moved toward the moment that would change everything. For a heartbeat, I simply stood there, half turned toward the head of the table, one hand still resting on the back of the chair that used to be mine. Caroline's smile had gone rigid, her fingers gripping the linen napkin in her lap. I could feel Mason's unease ripple through the air like a change in temperature. "It's just for tonight," she repeated, her tone now thinner, sharper. "Please, Mom, don't make this uncomfortable." The clatter of silverware softened. Even the children had gone quiet, their faces uncertain. Edward Hollister looked politely at his plate, as though etiquette forbade him from witnessing humiliation. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Part of me wanted to say all right to step aside and let her have it. Let her show this glittering room that she could control every detail. even her mother's place. But another part of me, something older, quieter, refused. I kept my hand on the chair. "Caroline," I said very softly, "your father built this table. He sanded it himself in the garage. We sat here every Christmas. I've kept that tradition alive since he passed." For a moment I thought I saw doubt in her eyes. Then she glanced toward her husband, toward Edward, and whatever wavered inside her hardened. "Mom, don't do this," she whispered, still smiling for the others. "It's not about you." I heard the words as if they were something solid, breaking inside my chest. Not about me. My hand trembled slightly, and I let go of the chair. Then it happened so small, so fast, I almost questioned if it was real. Caroline reached out, touched my arm, and gave a push. Not violent, not meant to hurt, just enough to move me aside. But my heel caught on the rug, and I stumbled backward, catching myself on the sideboard with a dull thud. The sound echoed through the room. Every fork froze midair. Mason half rose from his seat. Julia gasped. Edward's eyes widened his face, straining with awkward disapproval. Caroline's own expression flickered between horror and denial, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd done. I straightened slowly. My knees ached, but I forced myself to stand tall. The napkins, the candles, the carved lamb, all blurred around the edges. I looked at my daughter and saw for the first time not the child I raised, but a woman who no longer recognized where she came from. "I see," I said quietly. "The seat's yours then." My voice sounded too calm. It frightened me how even it was. Caroline stepped forward as if to apologize, but Edward interjected smoothly, "Let's sit, shall we? The food's getting cold." And so we did. I took the chair halfway down the table again, beside little Henry, who kept glancing at me with wide, confused eyes. Caroline resumed her place at the head, smoothing her dress, pretending nothing had happened. Her hands shook slightly as she passed the lamb to Edward. Mason murmured something about the wine's aroma, eager to fill the silence. The conversation crawled forward. Edward complimented the seasoning. Caroline agreed too loudly. I answered when spoken to, but kept my gaze on the white linen in front of me. The taste of the food might as well have been dust. Across from me, Julia whispered, "Grandma." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, and managed a smile. Her small hand slipped into mine under the table. That simple touch, warm, trusting, was the only thing keeping me from breaking. Halfway through dinner, Caroline tried again. "Mom, have some wine," she offered, her voice brittle. "No, thank you," I said. "I brought a bottle, but perhaps another time." The remark landed like a stone in still water. No one spoke after that. The air smelled of rosemary and tension. I thought of my husband then, how he'd once sat where Edward now was, carving meat with steady hands, proud of the family he'd built. He would not have recognized this room. When the plates were cleared, Caroline laughed too loudly at one of Edward's stories. Her earrings caught the light flashing like small, defiant sparks. She never looked at me again for the rest of the meal. I waited until the final toast, raised my glass without a word, and let the wine burn its way down. Around me, voices resumed their practiced rhythm, but I felt detached, as though I were watching from somewhere far away. By the time the children began yawning and the candles burned low, I had already decided what I would do. Not out of anger, not even out of pride, but because something sacred had been broken, and someone had to remember what it was meant to stand for. When I stood to leave, no one noticed right away. Caroline was busy gathering plates, her face composed again. Mason fetched coats for the guests. I walked toward the hallway slowly, my steps careful and measured. Behind me, laughter rose once more, the kind that fills silence but never mends it. I reached for my purse on the console, slipped on my coat, and stepped out into the cool Charleston night. The air smelled of salt and pine. For the first time all evening, it was clean. The guest bathroom was small but elegant, scented with jasmine soap and candle wax. I locked the door behind me and leaned against the sink, letting the sound of running water cover the faint tremor in my breath. My reflection looked unfamiliar. Eyes too bright, skin, pale mouth pressed into a line I didn't recognize. The humiliation still pulsed beneath my ribs. I had imagined that after losing my husband, nothing could wound me in that way again. I was wrong. There was a peculiar kind of pain in being dismissed by your own child, not with words of hatred, but with the cool efficiency of someone rearranging furniture. For a long moment, I simply stared at myself. The soft light caught the silver strands in my hair, the fine lines around my eyes. Proof of all the years I had given her every sacrifice, folded into a quiet kind of pride. What good had that pride done tonight? I turned off the faucet, dried my hands, and reached for my purse. Inside my phone blinked. My fingers hovered over the screen before pressing the number I hadn't called in nearly a year. Evelyn Shore, came the familiar voice on the other end, steady, composed a lawyer's tone that had soothed me through my husband's estate years ago. Evelyn, it's Marianne, I said. I'm sorry to bother you on Christmas Eve. There was a pause. Marianne, my God, it's been ages. Are you all right? I looked into the mirror again at the faint red mark blooming on my arm, where Caroline's hand had pushed me. I will be, I answered. I need your help with some paperwork. Of course. What kind? The kind that changes everything I said. I want to revoke Caroline's power of attorney immediately, and any business shares she holds in my name, transfer them back to my account. The house deed, too. Everything. Evelyn hesitated. Marianne, that's serious. Do you want to wait until after the holidays? No, I said, quietly. Tonight. She must have heard something in my voice because she didn't argue again. All right. I'll draft the documents first thing in the morning. Thank you. When the call ended, I slipped the phone back into my purse and stood still listening to the faint sounds of laughter drifting from the dining room. They were already pouring coffee, moving on. I looked once more into the mirror this time without flinching. The woman staring back wasn't broken, just awake. I smoothed my hair, straightened my blouse, and unlocked the door. The hallway was dim and quiet. From the living room, I could hear Caroline's voice, cheerful, practiced as she refilled her guests' glasses. I walked past the doorway, unnoticed the cool night air from the open front door brushing my skin as I stepped outside. The cold steadied me. Somewhere behind me, my daughter's laughter rang out again, and I realized it no longer had the power to hurt me. The drive home was short but endless. Charleston's streets were nearly empty, the air heavy with fog that blurred the lights into soft halos. I drove with both hands on the wheel, the silence in the car, thicker than the mist outside. The humiliation had cooled into something quieter, steadier, a clarity that felt almost like peace. When I reached my house, the porch light glowed just as I'd left it. The same soft amber my husband once insisted made a home look welcoming. I unlocked the door, stepped into the familiar stillness, and let my coat slide to the floor. My heels followed. The pie dish was still in the backseat untouched. I poured myself a glass of water, then sat at the kitchen table. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and last week's flowers. For a while, I simply stared at the phone lying beside the glass. My reflection shimmered faintly in the window, an old woman in her own kitchen, looking far calmer than she felt. At last, I picked up the phone and opened my contacts. The first call went to Tom Fields, my accountant, for nearly 20 years. He answered on the second ring, groggy but polite. "Tom, I said it's Marianne. I'm sorry to call this late." "Marianne, is everything okay? I need to make some changes," I said. "Immediately." He hesitated, then his voice softened. "All right. What kind of changes?" I read from the notes I'd jotted down on the back of a grocery receipt. "Freeze every account with Caroline Hollister's name attached. Cancel the co-signed line of credit for her boutique and revoke any personal guarantees I've provided. I want written confirmation by tomorrow morning." There was a long pause. "You're sure that's going to cause some noise?" "Yes," I said. "That's the idea." He didn't argue further. He knew me well enough to recognize finality when he heard it. "I'll take care of it. Merry Christmas, Marianne." I ended the call, then scrolled to the next number, First Atlantic Bank, where my husband and I had kept our accounts since before Caroline was born. A woman answered, cheerful in that professional way that never changes no matter the hour. "Evening," I said. "This is Marianne Kettering. I'd like to revoke all co-signing privileges on my daughter's business accounts, effective immediately." She asked a few questions, confirmed security details, and typed quietly on her end. "All right, Mrs. Kettering. The freeze will show on the system within an hour." "Thank you," I said. When the call ended, I sat back and listened to the refrigerator hum. Outside, fog pressed against the window panes, soft and dense, like breath on glass. It wasn't anger guiding me now. It was protection of what my husband had built, of what I had worked for decades to keep stable. Love without boundaries had turned to indulgence, and indulgence had turned her cruel. Maybe this was the only way to teach her what foundation she stood on. Before midnight, I made one last call to Evelyn. She answered on the first ring. "All done?" she asked. "Almost," I said. "One more thing, I want to terminate my guarantee on the lease for Caroline's shop. Can you handle that tomorrow?" "Of course. I'll send a courier to your house with the documents." "Thank you, Evelyn." When the final call ended, I set the phone down and folded my hands on the table. The clock above the stove read 12:04, Christmas Day. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock and the distant call of an owl from the marshes. I looked toward the front window at the warm halo of my porch light. It flickered once in the mist, then steadied again. I rose, turned off the kitchen light, and stood by the window for a long moment. Somewhere across town, my daughter was sleeping in a house that no longer had my name beneath its roof. And she didn't yet know that by morning, the world she'd built on my generosity would begin to crumble quietly, precisely like a bridge losing its final nail. The road stretched ahead in a soft blur of fog, the marshland on either side breathing out ribbons of mist that clung to the windshield. My wipers moved rhythmically, cutting through the haze in patient arcs. Charleston, after midnight, felt like another world, empty streets, shuttered shops, and the faint glimmer of Christmas lights still twinkling in quiet defiance of the cold. I drove slowly, hands steady on the wheel. The dashboard clock glowed 12:37. It was Christmas morning, technically, a thought that might once have made me smile. But tonight, it only deepened the silence inside me. For most of my life, I had driven this same route home after family gatherings, my husband beside me. Caroline, asleep in the back seat, the faint hum of carols on the radio. He used to squeeze my hand at stoplights and whisper, "She's turning out just fine, Mari. You've done well." I had believed him. I'd believed that love, consistent, forgiving, endlessly patient was enough to raise a good person. I thought if I gave her everything, she'd grow into gratitude. If I stayed kind, she'd stay kind too. But tonight, the memory of her hand pushing against my arm replayed over and over, the slight pressure, the sharp inhale, the way her voice trembled when she said, "Don't make this uncomfortable." It wasn't the force that hurt. It was the intention, the quiet erasure of everything I had been to her. The tires hummed against the damp pavement. I passed the church where I'd once taught Sunday school, the small marina where her father had taken Caroline fishing as a girl. Each familiar landmark blurred into the fog like ghosts of the life we'd built, visible then gone. Grief sat beside me like an old friend, one who no longer needed to speak. But beneath it, something else had begun to stir. Not anger, exactly, but a clear, cold understanding. Kindness without boundaries isn't virtue, it's surrender. I thought of the years I'd said yes when I should have said no. The times I'd bailed her out of overdrafts, paid for apartments she couldn't afford, rewritten her mistakes as learning experiences. Every decision came from love, and each one had quietly taught her that love had no cost. Now she believed that fully. The road curved toward the bridge, the city skyline flickering faintly beyond the fog. My headlights caught the outline of the water below, calm and dark. I slowed, rolling down the window to breathe the salt air. The cold stung my cheeks, but it steadied me. I realized as I crossed the bridge that something had shifted permanently. I wasn't the fragile woman who had stumbled at the dinner table a few hours ago. I wasn't anyone's victim, not anymore. By the time I reached the other side, I knew exactly what I had done that night and why it mattered. I hadn't acted out of revenge. I'd simply corrected the imbalance I'd allowed for too long. The fog began to thin as the first pale hint of dawn touched the horizon. I turned onto my street, passing quiet porches lined with wreaths and ribbons. My own house waited at the end, warm light spilling from the window I'd forgotten to turn off. I parked, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the stillness. Somewhere behind me, in another part of town, my daughter slept in comfort. She hadn't yet realized was borrowed. And soon, she would learn kindness has limits, and so does silence. The sky lightened faintly over the marsh. I took a slow breath, and for the first time that night, it didn't hurt. Caroline woke to the shrill, insistent ring of the house phone. For a moment, she thought it was part of a dream, the kind where sound and panic blur together, until Mason's groggy voice from beside her muttered, "Are you going to get that?" She reached for the receiver on the nightstand, her silk sleeve slipping down her arm. "Hello, Mrs. Hollister." The voice on the other end was brisk, all business. "This is Patricia from First Atlantic Bank. I'm calling to inform you that your business account ending in 9472 has been temporarily frozen pending authorization review." Caroline sat up. "That must be a mistake," she said quickly, brushing hair from her face. "There's a holiday transfer pending. My mother co-signed the lease." "Yes, ma'am," Patricia replied. "That co-signature has been revoked as of 6 a.m. today. I'm afraid all linked accounts are affected. You'll need to visit the branch in person to resolve it." The call ended before she could respond. Mason turned over, blinking. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said automatically, then threw off the covers. "Just a banking error." But the phone rang again, and again. By the third call, the color had drained from her face. One was the boutique supplier in Savannah, asking why their invoice payment had bounced. Another was the landlord, politely but firmly noting that without the financial guarantee on file, the property's lease would enter review. Mason swung his legs over the side of the bed. Caroline, talk to me. What's going on? She pressed her palms to her temples. I don't know. Everything's frozen. The accounts, the transfers, everything. He frowned, rubbing his eyes. Did you call your accountant? She shook her head, already dialing. Tom Fields didn't answer. The voicemail beeped, and her voice came out sharper than she intended. Tom, it's Caroline. I need you to call me back immediately. There's something wrong with the accounts, urgent. When she looked up, Mason was standing at the window, staring out at the fog-draped street. His reflection in the glass looked older than he had the night before. You think this has anything to do with your mother? The words made her throat tighten. Why would it? He turned his tone cautious. Because she's the only one who could revoke those guarantees. Caroline forced a laugh, brittle and unconvincing. Don't be ridiculous. She wouldn't do that. She's my mother. But even as she said it, she felt the truth slide coldly into her chest. The doorbell rang downstairs, a sharp, echoing chime that startled them both. Mason went to answer it, while she wrapped her robe tighter, her hands trembling. From the top of the stairs, she heard murmured voices. Then Mason called up Caroline. It's Edward. Her father-in-law stood in the foyer, impeccably dressed, despite the early hour. His gray suit was pressed his tie perfectly knotted, as though nothing about the world had shifted. But his eyes, calm, measured, suggested otherwise. Good morning, he said. Or perhaps not such a good one. Caroline descended the stairs, trying to compose herself. Edward, what's happened? The accounts are... I know, he interrupted gently. My banker called me early this morning. It appears your mother has made several decisive moves overnight. Decisive, she repeated. She's ruined us. Edward tilted his head slightly, regarding her with something between pity and disapproval. She's reclaimed what was hers. There's a difference. Mason looked between them helplessly. What can we do? Edward clasped his hands behind his back. You can start by learning how to live without leaning on other people's assets. Caroline stared at him, her voice cracking. You don't understand. This boutique is my life. My reputation. Your reputation was built on someone else's foundation, he said quietly. And foundations have owners. The phone rang again, slicing through the tension. Caroline ignored it, sinking onto the bottom step. Mason answered this time, listening for a few seconds, before lowering the receiver slowly. That was the landlord, he said. He wants us to vacate if the guarantee isn't reinstated within 72 hours. Caroline buried her face in her hands. The night's champagne and laughter felt like a dream from someone else's life. Edward stepped closer, his tone measured but not unkind. You know your mother came from very little. She understands survival. What she's done, it isn't cruelty, Caroline. It's consequence. She looked up, eyes burning. You think I deserve this? He paused. I think you might need it. The clock in the foyer ticked loudly, the sound filling the silence. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing a sky washed pale with morning. Caroline stood finally, her voice low. I'll fix this. I'll call her. Edward gave a faint smile. If you do, be ready to speak like a woman, not a daughter. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked into the kitchen, picked up the phone again, and stared at the familiar number glowing on the screen. Her thumb hovered over the button, but she couldn't press it. From the living room, Mason spoke softly to Edward, their voices low and indistinct. The world she'd built, the glossy boutique, the dinner parties, the photographs that proved she'd made it, was beginning to collapse, not with fire or noise, but with the quiet efficiency of paperwork and consequence. She sank into a chair, still holding the phone, listening to the sound of her own breathing. For the first time, Caroline understood what her mother's silence had meant last night. Not surrender, but judgment. By the time the sun broke through the fog, the calls had stopped coming. The damage was already complete. By mid-afternoon, the house felt hollow. The phone had gone quiet, though the silence was worse than the ringing had been. Mason was at the boutique, trying to reason with the landlord, and Caroline sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. She didn't understand. Frozen account statements, unsigned checks, and eviction notices half-folded like bad omens. When the doorbell rang again, she startled. Through the glass, she saw Edward Hollister standing on the porch, his expression unreadable. His composure was the kind that drew power without raising a voice, and for a moment, she considered pretending not to be home. But she knew he'd wait. He always did. "Edward," she said, forcing a smile as she opened the door. "Please come in." He stepped inside, glancing briefly at the mess on the table. "You look tired," he said. "It's been a morning," she replied weakly, motioning toward the living room. "Coffee?" He shook his head. "No. Let's talk." Caroline sat opposite him, clutching the edge of the sofa cushion. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that Edward had come to offer help alone, a business contact, a way to patch the bleeding. But the way he looked at her, steady, unflinching, told her otherwise. "I need to speak plainly," he began. "Last night, I saw something I can't unsee." She looked away. "You mean the dinner?" "I mean the way you treated your mother." Caroline's throat tightened. "It wasn't like that." She was being difficult, trying to— "Don't," he interrupted softly, but the word carried weight. "Don't justify it. I watched you humiliate her, Caroline. That wasn't strength, it was arrogance." Her breath caught anger flickering to life in her chest. "You don't understand our history. You have no right." He raised a hand, calm but final. "You're right. I don't know your history. But I do know decency when I see it and when I don't. What you did to her was cruel." Caroline stared at him, unable to find her defense. "You think I haven't paid for it?" she said. Finally, voice cracking. "My business is collapsing. The accounts." "That's consequence," Edward said quietly. "Not punishment. Your mother didn't destroy you, Caroline. She simply stopped protecting you from yourself." The words landed with surgical precision. She looked down at her hands, at the faint tremor in her fingers. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Edward stood adjusting his cufflinks. "I didn't come here to lecture you," he said, though the lecture had already done its work. "I came because I planned to speak with your mother this evening." Caroline's head snapped up. "You're going to call her Yes," he said. "To apologize for being a witness and doing nothing." "You don't owe her that," she said quickly. He looked at her with quiet sadness. "On the contrary, I owe it to myself. I've spent my life among people who mistake pride for virtue. It's time I worked with someone who knows the difference." She frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I'm starting a new community project," he said. "Affordable housing for retirees, something with dignity. I'd like your mother to join the board. She understands people better than most of the men I've done business with." The statement hit harder than any rebuke. Caroline felt something sharp and unfamiliar twist inside her, shame mixed with disbelief. "Edward," she said quietly, "please don't." He stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. "You've had every chance to show your mother respect. Maybe it's time someone else did." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "You should visit her, Caroline. Not to fix what's broken, just to admit that it is." When the door closed behind him, the house seemed even quieter. She sat on the sofa staring at the cooling cup of untouched coffee on the table. Across town, as Edward's car disappeared down the narrow road, he dialed a number from memory. Marianne Kettering, came the voice on the other end, steady, composed. "Marianne," he said. "This is Edward Hollister. I'm calling to say I owe you an apology for standing by last night. You deserved better than silence." There was a pause. "Thank you," she said finally. "That means more than you know." He exhaled, his tone softening. "And one more thing, I have a proposal. Something I think might interest you." By the time the call ended, the sun was low over Charleston's rooftops, and Edward felt a rare sense of rightness, a quiet conviction that for once he had chosen the side that mattered. By the end of the week, the boutique's glass doors were locked, and the "closed until further notice" sign hung crooked against the window. The mannequins still wore the new winter collection clothes Caroline had once bragged would define Charleston elegance. Now they looked like ghosts behind the glass, frozen in someone else's success. She stood across the street, her coat pulled tight against the cold wind. A delivery truck rumbled past, scattering dry leaves along the sidewalk. Inside the store, the lights were off, but she could still see the faint outline of her own reflection, staring back. Pale, uncertain. Small. By the time she got home, Mason's suitcase was already by the door. He was pacing the hallway, phone in hand, voice low and tense. "Just a few weeks," he was saying. "I need to meet with some investors in Atlanta. We'll get things straightened out." She stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "You're leaving." He ended the call, avoiding her eyes. "It's not what it sounds like. I just need space to figure things out. For all of us." "For all of us," she repeated. "Or just for you." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Caroline, I can't keep living in this tension. The creditors, your mother, the business, everything's collapsing. I need time." She stared at him, her voice trembling. "You mean you need distance?" He didn't answer. A moment later, he picked up his suitcase and kissed her on the cheek, like a stranger saying goodbye at an airport. "I'll call," he said, and stepped into the cold. The sound of the door closing was final. Upstairs, the house was eerily quiet. The children were at her friend Allison's for the afternoon, a mercy she hadn't yet had the courage to cancel. Caroline wandered from room to room, her heels clicking against marble floors that suddenly seemed too vast. Everywhere she looked, there were remnants of the life she'd built: frames of charity galas, glossy magazines with her boutique's name on the cover, a dozen gift bags from designers who no longer returned her calls. In the kitchen, unopened mail piled near the sink. Utility bills, mortgage warnings, a letter from the private school asking about the next semester's tuition. She ran her finger along the stack, but didn't open a single one. The silence pressed in until she couldn't bear it. She turned on the radio just to hear something human. A Christmas song floated through the speakers, soft, ironic, cruel in its cheerfulness. Caroline sank into one of the bar stools, staring at the glittering chandelier above. It used to make her proud, that glow of crystal and gold. Now it only reminded her how many things she couldn't afford to keep lit. When the children came home, she forced a smile, her voice steady. "Everything's fine," she told them. "Daddy's on a business trip." They nodded, too young to question. But when she tucked them into bed that night, her daughter asked softly, "Is Grandma still mad at you?" Caroline froze. "She's not mad," she whispered. "She's disappointed." The little girl's eyes glistened. "Will she come for Christmas next year?" "I don't know, sweetheart," she said, brushing her hair aside. "I really don't know." After they slept, Caroline stood in the doorway of their room for a long time. The quiet of the mansion felt heavier than ever, like the house itself was listening. Downstairs, she poured herself a glass of water and stared at the reflection in the window, the same woman who had once believed she could control everything. Now her empire was gone. Her husband was gone. Her reputation, her security, her mother's grace all stripped away. For the first time, she realized she was truly alone. Rain swept through Charleston in gray, relentless sheets that blurred the world into watercolor. By dusk, the streets were half flooded, and the oaks along the avenue bent beneath the wind. Marianne stood by her living room window, watching the storm roll across the marsh. The house was quiet, except for the steady hum of the rain on the roof and the faint ticking of the mantel clock. She had spent the afternoon reviewing architectural drafts for Edward's new housing project, plans for a modest complex near the harbor that would provide homes for widows and retirees. It was good work, the kind that built something real. Yet her thoughts had drifted more than once to Caroline. Every silence since Christmas seemed to echo with her name. The doorbell rang just as thunder cracked overhead. Marianne hesitated, unsure she'd heard it right. Then it rang again, urgent, uneven. She crossed the hall and opened the door. Caroline stood on the porch, soaked through to the bone. Her hair clung to her face mascara, streaking down like black tears. She looked smaller somehow, the poise and polish stripped away, leaving only a trembling daughter shivering in the rain. "Mom," she whispered. "Please, can I come in?" For a long moment, Marianne didn't move. The sight of her child drenched and broken pulled at something deep and primal inside her. But she stepped aside without a word, and Caroline entered, dripping onto the hardwood floor. Marianne fetched a towel from the linen cabinet and handed it to her. Caroline took it without meeting her eyes. "I didn't know where else to go," she said finally, her voice raw. "Mason's gone. The boutique's gone. I can't even pay the mortgage." Marianne nodded slowly. "I heard." Caroline looked up, startled. "You talked to Edward." "He called to check on me," Marianne said. "And yes, he mentioned the business. He also said you'd been struggling." Caroline sank onto the couch, twisting the towel in her hands. "Struggling," she repeated, almost laughing. "That's a nice word for it." The room filled with the sound of rain against the windows. Marianne sat in the chair opposite her, her back straight, her expression unreadable. "Mom," Caroline began, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I don't even know how to explain that night. I was trying to impress Edward, to make everything perfect, and when you stood there, I just panicked. I didn't mean to hurt you." Marianne's gaze didn't waver. "You didn't just hurt me, Caroline. You pushed me." Caroline flinched. "I know." "No," Marianne said softly. "Not just physically. You pushed everything I taught you. Kindness, humility, gratitude. You pushed the idea that love doesn't need an audience." Tears welled in Caroline's eyes. "I thought I was being strong." "You were being proud," Marianne said. "And pride has a way of emptying a house faster than debt." The words landed quietly, but they carried the weight of years. Caroline bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. "I've lost everything, Mom. Mason left. The kids. They keep asking why you don't visit. I don't know what to tell them." Marianne's voice softened. "Tell them the truth. That their mother is learning what it means to rebuild." Caroline looked up again, eyes swollen. "Can you ever forgive me?" Forgiveness. It lingered between them like a fragile thing. Marianne wanted to reach across the space and take her hand, to erase the pain of that night. But something in her heart resisted the easy comfort of absolution. "Caroline," she said gently, "forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting." "I can forgive you." but I can't pretend we're the same as before. That night changed us both. Caroline nodded, tears spilling freely now. I'll do anything to make it right. Then start by making yourself right, Marianne replied. Not for me, for your children. They need to see who you become after the fall. The clock chimed softly from the mantel. The sound filled the space where words failed. Marianne stood, walked to the door and opened it. The rain had softened to a mist, the air cool and clean. Caroline rose slowly, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Mom Marianne managed a faint smile. Get home safe, Caroline. You'll be all right. Caroline hesitated in the doorway, wanting to step forward to bridge the distance. But Marianne didn't move closer. She only reached out and touched her daughter's damp sleeve, one small gesture, tender but measured. Thank you, Carolyn, whispered. Marianne nodded once, then closed the door softly, not in anger, not in rejection, but in truth. On the other side, she leaned against the wood and let out a slow breath. The rain had stopped. The house, though quiet, no longer felt empty. It felt steady, like something rebuilt one honest decision at a time. 3 weeks passed before Marianne sent the invitation. It was handwritten, brief, and delivered to Caroline's house by mail, no call, no text. Sunday afternoon, coffee at 3. Bring the children. There was no mention of Edward, but Caroline knew he would be there. Her mother never left things to chance. When the day arrived, Charleston was bright and still, the winter sun pouring through the bare oaks that lined the street. Carolyn drove in silence, the children in the back seat, whispering to each other. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles whitened. Every mile closer to her mother's house felt like a confession waiting to happen. Marianne's home looked almost the same as it had for decades, white shutters, neat hedges, the faint smell of rosemary drifting from the garden. But when Caroline stepped inside, she felt the difference. The air was lighter, as if the house had exhaled years of unspoken tension. Edward was already seated in the parlor, his posture composed, a mug of coffee balanced perfectly in his hand. He stood when she entered and gave a courteous nod. Caroline, he said softly. Good to see you. Mr. Hollister, she murmured, avoiding his eyes. Her children rushed past her toward the couch where Marianne was arranging a plate of lemon cookies. She bent to hug them both, her movements slow but sure. You've grown in just 3 weeks, she said with a faint smile. Do you still like sugar in your cocoa? The small exchange steadied the room. For a few moments, it almost felt like family again. Then Marianne turned to her daughter. Sit down, Caroline. We'll talk before the coffee cools. Caroline obeyed, perching on the edge of the sofa. Her throat was dry, her pulse loud in her ears. I asked you here, Marianne began, because truth has a way of showing up whether we want it to or not. Better we meet it together. Edward set his cup aside and folded his hands. The children watched quietly, sensing something important was unfolding. Caroline swallowed hard. I owe everyone here an apology, she said, her voice unsteady. Especially you, Mom. Marianne said nothing. Caroline took a breath and looked at her mother directly for the first time since Christmas Eve. That night, when I asked you to move, I thought I was protecting something. My image, maybe. My husband's pride. I'd spent years trying to prove I belonged in Mason's world, in Edward's world. Every dinner, every fundraiser, every boutique launch, I was terrified of seeming small, of being the woman who needed her mother to prop her up. Her voice cracked, but she went on. So when you stood there in my house in his world, I panicked. I thought if I made you smaller, maybe I'd look bigger. No one moved. The clock ticked steadily from the mantel. Edward's gaze was calm, but unflinching. And did it work? Caroline shook her head, tears spilling freely now. No. It ruined everything. The business, the marriage, my peace. I lost everything I built, and I see now it wasn't mine to begin with. Marianne's expression didn't soften. You didn't lose it, Caroline. You handed it away. The words cut through the air, sharp but true. Caroline bowed her head, sobbing quietly. I know. And I can't ask you to forgive me. But I needed you to hear me say it out loud. The children shifted on the couch, wide-eyed. Marianne glanced at them, then back at her daughter. You've said it, she replied. Now what will you do with it? I'll rebuild, Carolyn said. Not for appearances. For them. She gestured toward the children. And for myself, if I can. Marianne nodded, once a small movement that carried weight. Then that's enough for today. She stood and poured more coffee into Edward's cup, then into Caroline's. Drink. It's bitter, but it's real. Caroline accepted the cup with trembling hands. The smell of roasted beans and lemon cookies filled the air. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close to understanding. Edward reached for a cookie and passed one to each of the children, then met Marianne's eyes across the table. There was quiet pride there, the kind born from respect rather than alliance. When the children began to laugh softly over crumbs and cocoa, the house seemed to loosen its breath. Caroline looked around the parlor, the photographs, the woman who had once been her entire foundation, and realized that the silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like space being cleared for something new. Marianne leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady, but no longer cold. Truth, she said quietly, always takes its time. But it never leaves empty-handed. Outside, the light through the window shifted to gold. The rain that had fallen for days was gone, and for the first time in months, the air smelled like something close to peace. The following afternoon, Caroline returned to her mother's house alone. The children stayed with a neighbor, and the weight of that quiet drive pressed on her chest like a confession. She parked beneath the magnolia tree, its branches glistening from last night's rain, and took a steadying breath before knocking. Marianne opened the door herself. She was dressed simply linen blouse, soft cardigan, no makeup. The house smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. You came, Marianne said. I said I would, Caroline replied softly. They moved to the dining room where 2 cups of tea waited on the table. It wasn't lost on Caroline that they sat at the same table where she had once thrown her mother's advice aside like it was something fragile and outdated. Marianne folded her hands. Yesterday was a start, she said. But words alone don't change anything. You asked for forgiveness, Caroline. That's not something I can give. It's something you have to earn. Caroline nodded, her throat tightening. Tell me what to do. For now, you'll do what you should have done years ago, Marianne said calmly. Work. Not for appearance, not for credit, but for substance. Caroline frowned slightly. Work where? There's an opening at the community housing project Edward and I are developing, Marianne said. They need someone to coordinate donations paperwork and volunteer shifts. It's not glamorous and it doesn't pay much, but it's honest. Caroline hesitated. You want me to work with you? Marianne met her eyes. No, Caroline. For the community. Beside me if you earn that right. Caroline's eyes filled with tears. I'll do it. Whatever it takes. Good, Marianne said. You'll report to Mr. Alvarez, he oversees logistics. I told him not to treat you differently. If you show up late or act entitled, you'll lose the position. No one there cares who your husband's family was. Caroline looked down at her hands. That's fair. There's more, Marianne continued. The boutique lease, the one I guaranteed. I'll settle the final payment, but you'll repay me bit by bit from your wages. Every dollar. It may take years. Caroline nodded, silent tears running down her cheeks. I understand. And the children? Marianne said softly. They'll need stability. I'll help with school, but not as a crutch. You'll attend parent meetings, volunteer where needed, and cook your own dinners. No more nannies, no shortcuts. A quiet sob escaped Caroline's throat. I'll do better, Mom, I promise. Marianne's tone softened, but her gaze stayed firm. Promises are easy. Consistency isn't. What I want for you isn't punishment, it's purpose. You lost yourself chasing other people's approval. It's time to find who you are without it. Caroline nodded again, unable to speak. The words weren't cruel. They were precise, like a surgeon's cut, made to save, not wound. Marianne stood and placed a folded sheet of paper on the table, a simple list of the terms she had outlined. These are the conditions. If you can meet them, then maybe one day forgiveness won't have to be asked for. It will just exist. Caroline rose slowly, took the paper, and pressed it to her chest. Thank you, she whispered. Marianne gave a small nod. Start Monday. 8 sharp. When Caroline stepped outside, the air was crisp, the late afternoon light slanting gold through the magnolias. She felt both lighter and heavier at once, like someone finally given direction after being lost too long. Inside, Marianne stood by the window, watching her daughter walk down the path. For the first time in years, she didn't feel anger or grief, just the quiet, steady hope that maybe this time love could teach through structure what kindness alone never could. By January, Charleston had settled into a gray, quiet winter. The boutiques along King Street were half empty, their windows frosted with salt from the harbor air. Caroline passed them each morning on her way to Jefferson Elementary, where she'd begun teaching art 2 weeks after her conversation with Marianne. It wasn't a glamorous position. The classrooms smelled faintly of glue and chalk, and the tables were scarred with years of paint stains. But for the first time in her life, Caroline's work wasn't about presentation. It was about presence. She arrived early, stayed late, and learned the rhythm of children's laughter and watercolor splatters. The pay was modest, barely enough to cover groceries and the small apartment she now rented near the river. But she found a strange kind of comfort in the simplicity of it. The smell of coffee brewing in the teacher's lounge, the soft murmur of students who called her Miss Hollister with unguarded affection. On Saturdays, she volunteered at a women's shelter in the North District, a place Marianne had quietly helped fund for years. Caroline folded donated clothes, sorted canned goods, and painted murals with the residents' children. It was humbling work, but it filled a part of her she hadn't realized was starving. Sometimes, when she caught her reflection in the shelter's hallway mirror, she barely recognized herself. Not because she looked older or tired, though she did, but because she finally looked real. The children adapted faster than she expected. They missed the big house, but they adjusted to the smaller apartment, the dinners cooked together, the walks to school. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table finishing homework, her son looked up and said, "You laugh more now, Mom." She froze, pencil in hand. "Do I?" He nodded. "It's different. It sounds real." Caroline smiled, blinking back tears. Maybe it is. On Sundays, they drove to Marianne's house for dinner. Nothing extravagant, just stew and cornbread, sometimes a pie if the week had gone well. The visits were still measured polite, but warmer with each passing week. Marianne spoke more freely now, sometimes even with a hint of humor, and the children adored her. Caroline didn't ask for forgiveness anymore. She didn't need to. Her mother's quiet acceptance at the dinner table, an extra spoon in the pot, a soft pat on her shoulder was enough. At school, one of her students, a shy girl named Lila, stayed behind after class one afternoon. She held out a crumpled piece of paper, a watercolor of a tree bent by wind but still standing. "It's you," the girl said. "You told us art should be honest." Caroline smiled, touched. "It's beautiful," she said, and pinned it on the wall beside her desk. That night, as she walked home through the soft drizzle, she thought of how far she'd fallen and how far she'd climbed back. The work was hard, the money scarce, but her heart felt steadier than it had in years. When she reached the apartment, the children were already asleep, their drawings scattered across the table. She turned off the light, pausing by the window to look out at the harbor. The reflection that met her gaze was no longer the woman who'd once demanded a seat of honor at a table built by someone else. This woman had earned her place quietly, honestly, one winter day at a time. By early March, the cold had begun to ease, though. Charleston's nights still carried a chill that settled deep in the bones. Carolyn often sat by the small kitchen table after the children were asleep, a cup of tea cooling beside her, a single lamp casting a pool of light across a stack of papers. That was when she wrote. She didn't plan the letters, they just came. Some were short, a few lines of thanks or memory. Others filled several pages. She never reread them. She didn't sign them either, though she always began the same way. "Dear Mom. Dear Mom. The kids are doing well. We planted basil on the balcony. It actually grew this time. Dear Mom, I wanted to tell you I used your biscuit recipe. It still works magic even when I don't. Dear Mom, I'm sorry I made your love feel like an obstacle instead of a gift. I see it now, how much strength it takes to be kind when you've been hurt." The letters piled up over the weeks, tucked into a wooden box she kept in the kitchen drawer, the same box that once held receipts from her boutique. Now, instead of bills, it carried pieces of humility and peace she wasn't ready to say aloud. Sometimes she thought about mailing one, but every time she sealed an envelope, she stopped herself. It wasn't shame anymore. It was timing. Some truths she decided had to ripen before they were received. Across town, Marianne had no idea about the letters, but she sensed the quiet shift between them. Their Sunday dinners had grown easier, laughter less forced. Caroline no longer arrived with the brittle brightness of apology, but with a quiet steadiness. She asked about Marianne's garden, brought small gifts for the house, nothing expensive, just thoughtful. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the marsh, Marianne lit the lantern on her porch, as she always did. She'd started the habit years ago after her husband died, a way of saying, "I'm still here. Come home when you're ready." She didn't think about it much anymore, but she never forgot to do it. That night, Caroline drove past after finishing her shift at the shelter. The road curved gently along the marsh, and in the distance, she saw the soft glow of her mother's porch lantern steady against the dark. She slowed the car. For a moment, she thought about stopping knocking on the door, handing over one of the letters, saying everything she'd written in ink but never spoken aloud. But she didn't. Instead, she sat there in the idling car, watching the golden light flicker through the fog. She whispered, barely audible, "I'm trying, Mom." The rain began again, soft and rhythmic on the windshield. Inside her house, Marianne sat by the window with a book she wasn't reading. The lantern's glow stretched across the porch, lighting the path to the garden gate. She smiled faintly, feeling an inexplicable calm, an intuition that somewhere out in the dark something unspoken had just been said. Caroline drove away after a few minutes, her heart lighter. the letter she'd meant to deliver still resting on the passenger seat. Later that night, when she tucked the letter into the wooden box with the others, she noticed her hands no longer trembled. She didn't need the words to be read to know they'd been heard. Nearly a year had passed since the night Caroline sat in her kitchen, writing words she never meant to send. The wooden box in her drawer was nearly full now, each folded page a chapter of her slow redemption. But one evening, as summer leaned into autumn, she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a letter that felt different, quieter, simpler. Dear Mom, I won't take much of your time. I just wanted to say thank you. Losing everything wasn't the end I feared, it was the beginning I needed. I learned more from losing you than I ever did by winning your approval. I see now that your strength was never about pride. It was about truth. I hope I've begun to understand that kind of love. She signed it this time. With love, Caroline. There was no tremor in her hand as she sealed the envelope. The next morning, she mailed it before she could change her mind. Days later, Marianne found the letter in her mailbox just before dawn. She carried it inside, still in her robe, and sat by the kitchen window, where the first light touched the counter. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, but hesitant, like someone relearning how to speak. She opened it. Slowly, read the short note once then again. Her eyes filled not with sorrow, but something gentler. The words didn't ask for anything. They simply were. Marianne placed the letter beside her cup of tea and looked out toward the porch, where the lantern still burned softly against the pale morning. She smiled a small, quiet smile and whispered into the stillness, "You made it, sweetheart." The city glowed with quiet warmth that December night. Twinkling lights lined the iron balconies downtown, and a soft drizzle carried the scent of pine and roasted chestnuts through the streets. Inside the community shelter, laughter rose over the clatter of serving trays and the hum of conversation. Caroline stood near the buffet table, her hair pulled back apron dusted with flour. She'd spent the past month helping organize the annual Christmas dinner, coordinating donations, sorting gifts, and greeting guests as they arrived. It wasn't glamour, but it was purpose. Every plate served, every hand she shook, reminded her how far she'd come from the woman who once measured worth in chandeliers and titles. When the last family left and the volunteers began cleaning up, Caroline stepped outside for air. The rain had eased into mist, the streets reflecting the soft shimmer of string lights. She sat on the front steps, tired but peaceful, when a familiar voice called from behind her. "Someone left this for you." It was Mr. Alvarez, the project supervisor, holding a small cream-colored envelope. Her name was written across it in her mother's neat cursive. Carolyn turned it over in her hands before opening it. Inside was a single folded note. "Dinner tomorrow, 6 o'clock. Bring nothing but honesty. Mom." Her breath caught. No grand speeches, no conditions. Just that one line, simple and disarming. She pressed the paper to her chest, the corners softening under her fingers. Around her, the city hummed with the sounds of the season bells. Laughter, the faint whistle of a train in the distance. For the first time in years, Christmas didn't feel like a reminder of loss. It felt like an open door. When she finally stood to leave, she slipped the note carefully into her coat pocket and whispered to herself, "All right, Mom. Tomorrow." The lantern light outside the shelter flickered, mirroring the one she knew would already be burning on her mother's porch. The night air carried the scent of salt and pine. The sky brushed with the faint glow of distant stars. Marianne stood on the porch, her lantern burning steady beside her. The light cast a golden circle across the steps, soft against the winter dark. From down the street came the sound of tires on wet pavement. A small car slowed, headlights dimming. Caroline stepped out, first her children, following close behind, their breath white in the cold. For a moment, they just looked at each other, mother and daughter, the space between them filled with everything they'd said and everything they hadn't. Then Marianne took a slow step forward. Caroline did too. The embrace came naturally, quiet and unhurried. No speeches, no tears, just warmth. Real, unguarded, earned. The children wrapped around them, both, laughter breaking softly through the silence. Behind them, the lantern's flame flickered steady and alive, casting light over the snow-dusted path. When they went inside, Marianne left it burning on the porch. It would stay lit through the night, a silent promise that the house and the love within it would never close its door again.